In today's video, we will reveal the hidden truth that will make or break your dream of building your perfect keyboard. Everything on our desks is loaded with technology, like our computers, monitors, and phones. But our keyboards, and especially switches, aren't actually tech at all. Now, most people would say they are, but they're actually not. And there are 4 major implications of that. Everything around us can be put on the scale between the technological and the non-technological. Switches are here, closer to the non-technological side of things. Now, one way to define technology is being able to do more with less. So something like computer chips are 100% technology. Moore's law says that every couple of years, chips get smaller, faster, and more powerful. So a chip today can do much more than a chip from many years ago. Not only that, but even a tiny computer that fits in the palm of your hand has more computing power than a computer that once took up an entire room. So we're definitely doing more with less here. Now let's talk about iPhones. iPhones contain those chips we just talked about, so every year we'll see improvements there. And there are also the annual improvements in cameras and screens too. But then there are these subjective factors like design and brand involved. And that's not something you can definitively say improves year over year. So iPhones are still pretty technological, but definitely less so than computer chips. Then on the more subjective side of things, we have shoes and switches. Yes, there are some technological innovations involved with both. If you play basketball, you might need shoes that help you jump higher. If you care about RGB, you need switches that will diffuse light well. But technology is a secondary factor when it comes to those things. It's actually not the driving force behind our purchasing decisions. Anyone can wear Air Forces even if they don't play basketball. They might just like the way it looks. Anyone can get these flame red switches, for example, even if they don't use RGB. They might just like the way it feels. If we go back to our definition of technology, which is doing more with less, then switches haven't really progressed in that regard. Here's a story to demonstrate that. In the mechanical keyboard community, one of the most coveted switches are linear switches produced by Cherry before the 90s. These are the vintage Cherry MX Blacks, also known as Vint Blacks. People are drawn to them because of their smoothness and trademark, deep and satisfying Cherry sound. People begin taking old keyboards apart, harvest the Vint Blacks, and then sell them. And there's a fixed supply of these Vint Blacks on the market because you can't produce more switches from the 80s and 90s. So there's this scarcity involved. People are willing to undergo this effort to do this harvesting because there's so much demand for them and the supply is fixed. So what does this remind you of? To me, this is just like harvesting natural resources, like gold. Natural resources are just extraction. They're stuff that Mother Nature has given us, and we just have to dig it out to make money. And because there's a fixed amount of gold and Vint Blacks out there, as long as there's persistent demand, the price will increase over time. Now, if we define technology as doing more with less, then natural resources are the exact opposite of technology. As technology progresses, its cost will consistently decrease over time. But with natural resources, due to scarcity, the price will always go up over time. So, from a pricing perspective, switches are definitely not a technological good. If switches were a technology, then these old and dusty Vint Blacks would not be coveted. No one pays premiums for outdated technology. Here's another way to put this. The alternative to mechanical keyboard switches are the cheap membrane sheets found in keyboards like these. Since a rubber sheet is a lot cheaper to produce than switches, you can do more with less in terms of price. Plus, when typing, one keystroke is one keystroke. You can type all day on a membrane keyboard, just as you could on a mechanical one. So the only way a mechanical keyboard is better than a cheap membrane one is because we've deemed it to be better in a non-technological or non-objective sense. Now, this has real consequences which should change the way we view switches. Number 1 is to not get FOMO. What's new is not necessarily better. This is not like the case of new iPhones, where you should be lining up days in advance before launch day. It's closer to lining up to get a pair of limited edition drop of sneakers. It's fine if you like them, but the reasoning for lining up breaks down if you just go, whoa, this is the newest pairs of shoes, and I want them because they're the newest pairs of shoes. Since we're not dealing with the technology, what's new is not necessarily better. The only place where newness could be important is if you think it's trendy or fashionable. But I'll come back to how trends relate to switches at a later point. The second point has to do with timelessness. The flip side of FOMO is that what's old is not necessarily bad. If that were the case, then the obsession over the vintage cherry blacks simply would not exist. The reason people swear by them is not because it's not outdated, but instead, it's seen as a revered classic. The lesson here is that you shouldn't discount switches just because they've been out for a few years, or a few decades even. There's no expiration date involved here. By the same time, I don't think you should blindly revere the classics either. In fact, I'd just say to be agnostic of time when deciding whether or not a switch might be for you. Point number 3 is to de-emphasize measurements. Goodness for non-technological products like switches cannot be measured. You end up making a category error when you try to quantify that. Only in very limited circumstances could that be the case. For example, going back to RGB, if you care about that a lot, then maybe a measure like luminosity will be useful. But doing stuff like calculating the millimeter squared of stem wobble frankly should not matter too much. There is the case that for some, the less the better, but I think it is precisely due to this over-indexing on the quote-unquote measurables, as it would with technology, that has led to a fetishizing minimal stem wobble. And here we get to point number 4, which is the importance of descriptors. Since it's the subjective factors that matter the most, we should do a better job of communicating them. What I mean is that descriptors such as clackiness, orthogonalness, or smoothness are kind of just overdone and cliched, and they actually don't communicate that much. Words like that fail to provide us with the clarity of thought with regards to knowing what we want. And when we don't know or can't express what we want, when our mind is muddled, we end up outsourcing our thinking and our desires to others. And at that point, you're just imitating what others want. Earlier, I mentioned stuff about trends, and in theory, the most popular option is the best option. You know, you have this sort of wisdom of the crowds thing going on. Like, this works for fashion. You want to look nice, and that might require keeping up with the times. You don't want to look outdated. In the keyboard context, following trends works for cases and keycaps. Since those things are outward facing, there is a sense in which they're like fashion. But for switches, it breaks down because they're mostly non-visual, right? They're sandwiched between your case and your keycaps. If keycaps and cases are like your tops and bottoms and shoes, then surely switches are kind of like underwear. So it is a little ridiculous to put a lot of weight on the social factor of switches, unless you're, I don't know, showing them off or something. Plus, trends around switches usually lead to bad outcomes. We've seen this sort of irrational exuberance around switches, such as the Holy Pandas, where intense tactility became this end-all, be-all thing. And my suspicion is that only a minority of people really like that intense tactile feel. So this is just a guess, but the recent obsession with linear switches is because we had a tactility hangover after being obsessed with super tactile switches for so long. And now, as a reaction, we're swinging to the complete opposite side, which, to be clear, is not good either. We as a group really shouldn't be migrating from one extreme to the other. So what we're doing with Milktooth is to empower the consumer against the excesses of hype. There's a whole world of switches out there just waiting to be discovered, and you shouldn't be herded into one or two consensus choices. But the dizzying variety makes it difficult to know which one is right for you. Our try-at-home program lets you try out 10 switches right in the comfort of your home before making a purchase. We believe in putting the power back in your hands when it comes to selecting a keyboard switch. By trying before you buy, you can make an informed decision and feel confident in your purchase. At the end of the day, our preferences in switches really shouldn't be monolithic. The best way to be in control of your own unique preferences is to simply try them yourself and decide which one is the best for you. In conclusion, just because we can't objectively define what's good or bad in switches doesn't mean we're lost in a subjective wilderness. Indeed, there are ways to evaluate things that can't be objectively measured. The Michelin Guide, the world's most influential restaurant guide, is a prime example. The guide focuses on the overall experience, articulating every aspect from ambiance to cuisine and service without relying on technical specifications. In the keyboard hobby, we can take inspiration from the Michelin Guide and communicate excellence without solely depending on the measurables. We should focus on individual preferences to identify the best switch for each person. but it's always easier to diagnose the disease than to cure it. So now I really want to hear from you. How do you pick what switches are the best? What aspects of a switch's performance do you value the most? And how do you think we can better communicate those qualities as a community? Let me know if you prefer this style or the more traditional switch reviews, or maybe a blend of both. Feel free to leave a comment, but if you find YouTube comments to be a little cumbersome, we also have a Discord community linked below the like button. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a nice day.